Ukrainian soldiers in Bakhmut, our troops are not being protected. And yeah, he says, if you go to the front, it's a 30 to 70 chance that you'll make it back at all. These people are being killed. And of course, blown to pieces, right, by artillery shells is what most of the fighting is. So it's just an absolute horror show going on over there. And this article is a really in-depth thing. The guy spent at least a few days at the front here interviewing different guys about what's going on.
Remember, Scott, that is a Ukrainian newspaper.
Yes, and clearly a very pro-regime one. Yeah, this is not some
pro-regime. Yeah. It's not pro-Russian. It's just telling you the truth.
Right. Yeah, and it's you gotta figure maybe some of the worst is left out, but what remains is really bad. And they're talking about essentially a big part. Go ahead.
The other thing to keep in mind is the Ukrainians have already fired 1 million artillery shells. That doesn't include their use of drones and rockets and so forth. Mm-hmm. And now they're effectively running out. One of the points that the author of that article makes is that in most cases, they're getting no artillery support at all from their own side.
And the artillery they have is literally from World War II.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, the problem is everyone who looked at this war from the beginning is getting an education, because just about everybody underestimated, the amount of ammunition and the losses that would be taken. And people overestimated the effect of many weapons. And many of the weapons that we produced, we thought would be superstar performers, both German and American, didn't turn out to be that way. Mm-hmm. So everybody got something wrong on this. But right now, the people suffering are the Ukrainians. And the real question is, what's next? And I think next is collapse. And the question is, what do we do when this becomes clear? What do we do when the Russians break out and simply overrun all of eastern Ukraine? Are we going to go into this ourselves?
You know what?
Which is my great nightmare.
Go back 1 year. I mean, I think we're fighting Plan B right now, because Plan A, I was just reading one this morning from the Washington Post from last March, that, the Ukrainians have done pretty good in blunting the Russians' advance, but everyone here in D.C. and at the Pentagon expects that Kiev will fall within a few weeks or so. And then we'll go back to Plan A, which was backing an insurgency, as they talked about in December 21 and January and February 22 in, 15 different press releases and statements here and there, that we're going to replicate Afghanistan. Just a few months after finally losing Afghanistan themselves, after, supposedly taming the blowback from the last time they did this to the Russians in Afghanistan, they said, this is the model. This is what we're going to do. We're going to give them javelins and all this, but we're going to be backing essentially the Azov battalion, because the Ukrainian military, they expected to be completely smashed within the first, month or so. And so I wonder if that's the answer, that, when and if at some point the structure of the Ukrainian state and its military forces east of the river finally are just broken, then that's fine. Then they just go right back to hiring Right Sector and C-14 and Azov to go do, suicide attacks, moderate rebel antics, stuff like that.
Well, as we said earlier, everyone misjudged the situation, the Russians included. And what we have today is the result of everyone's misjudgment. We underestimated the Russians based on the first few weeks, because the Russians deliberately went in there in pursuit of a very different set of goals and objectives than we imputed to them. All they were interested in was making the Minsk Accords actually work, to get Ukrainians, Ukrainian Russians who were living in Ukraine, equality before the law, and get the two breakaway republics the recognition they deserve as effectively Russian enclaves, and recognize the legitimacy of Russia's rule over Crimea. And then, neutrality for Ukraine, which I always felt would be a blessing. And indeed, I think it would be now, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Now, here we are a year later, and the Russians have said, okay, you want to wage war, we're going to wage war. And they built a force to do that, but they also have to confront the reality that the weather has to cooperate. And it took them until December to really get this force in place and trained. And when January came, they didn't get the level of freezing that they wanted that would support maneuver. And so they reverted to long-range attack and incremental moves in the south to consolidate control over the Donbass. When Bakhmut falls and the towns to their east of Bakhmut fall, that effectively is the end of the battle for the Donbass, which is what everybody wants because it's the income-producing area. So once that's over, and you get a dry season finally, and get past this muddy season, which is horrendous, then I think the movement begins. And how far will that go? Well, you just said something that's very important. If you're sitting in Moscow and you're hearing people say, we will stay with this to the bitter end, our goal is to fatally weaken Russia, to drive out Putin, to potentially even dismember the state. And failing that, we're going to launch an Afghanistan-style insurgency. You hear this from Moscow, or you're sitting in Moscow, you hear this. The only conclusion that you can reach is that I have to end this war. And the only way I can end it is to march several 100,000 Russian troops all the way to the Polish border. That's the problem.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And, war is a government program. And so, the self-licking ice cream cone and all that. I mean, and in fact, I think we talked about this a year ago, that if the Russians succeed in taking the East, well, now what? Now they've left an enemy rump state dominated by the hardest right-wing Ukrainian nationalists in alliance with NATO and the Poles. That is going to be even worse thorn in their side, or as an equal thorn in their side to the previous situation. So then they're just going to have to solve that problem. Then once they solve that problem, now they've just picked up 2 new NATO nations on their borders.
Well, that's right. And that's something they obviously wanted to avoid. But my supposition, and perhaps I'm wrong, but my supposition is that by the time they've closed on the Dnieper, the Europeans will say that's enough. And they don't want this sort of unrelenting insurgent warfare in Western Ukraine under any circumstances. It's very difficult to wage it there, to be blunt, because other than the Carpathian Mountains that are in the far west, the rest of Western Ukraine is largely open, rolling countryside. So that's a tough place to run an insurgency. It ends up becoming simply a set of targets on a daily basis for Russian standoff attack weapons. But I think the Europeans will oppose that, because there's always the danger, if this drags on, how long before it starts spilling into Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Lithuania. And the Russians aren't interested in that. They don't want it to go on. The Europeans don't want it to go on. Of course, there's always the outside possibility that someone in Washington, D.C. wakes up and smells the coffee. Mm-hmm. I think that is possible, because now I'm beginning to detect this new groundswell to justify enormous defense spending by talking about the looming China threat. And you got to stop and ask yourself a question. If we're happy with what's happening in Ukraine, why are we now shifting the conversation to China?
Yeah.
And of course, the Chinese are many things, but they're certainly not a military threat in the way that they're being described, and far from it. I don't see any evidence for any Chinese interest in attacking the United States. I don't see any interest in the Chinese attacking Taiwan. In fact, we know that the Taiwan government and Beijing are constantly talking to each other on back channels. It's not going to be a war there. So why are we talking about suddenly China again? I think they're trying to change the subject in anticipation of everything falling apart in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I would hate for them to hawk it up against China, full stop, even if it's an excuse to change the subject from Ukraine. But I'll take it. Sort of the way they finally shut up about when the Ukraine thing broke out. Well, at least they shut up about. So I don't know. And let's get back to China in a minute, because I'm interested in your takes on that. It's really important stuff. But on the question of the presumed sooner or later medium-term future here loss of the Ukrainian military, and then the choice being either, we discussed the possibility of an insurgency, and then, as you're saying, the Russians will need to take the whole west of the country if we do them like that, and the Europeans are going to want to stop. What about the other option that you brought up a couple times now, which is what John Mearsheimer warned about last summer, which is that he thinks that Biden and his people are so committed to their rhetoric about making sure that this works that they will escalate. They'll use the U.S. Navy, they'll send in the Marines, they'll do something crazy and turn this into a real war between America and Russia. Now, I guess changing the subject to China is one way out of that, but do you think that that is a real worry?
Well, I don't know what the Marines would do. They're pretty light, other than go if they were to enter the current theater of war, they'd be killed. They're not the U.S. Army. They don't have massive quantities of armor. In fact, the U.S. Army isn't the U.S. Army anymore. I think we'd be lucky to get 50,000 combat troops on the ground for any length of time out of this army of what, 450,000, 460,000. We just don't have that many people in the combat units with the right equipment. I don't think that happens. If you widen this to the use of the Navy, well, then surface vessels will be sunk in great quantities. The Russians rely heavily on their submarine fleet, and submarines are extremely difficult to deal with. We'd end up in some long and tiring exercise with our submarines attacking theirs or trying to find them. And then, of course, that would halt all transatlantic movement immediately. So that means you can't resupply anybody over there unless you use aircraft. And even then, I think that would be hazardous. The Russians may decide to shoot everything down that comes across the Atlantic. I'm not sure that's true. My own thinking is that they will try to change the subject as it becomes clear that this is a disaster.
Yeah.
What happened when Washington left Vietnam, which was clearly a disaster? Well, they stopped talking about it.
Right.
And the same thing happened when we left Afghanistan.
Yeah. And Iraq too.
What's the mainstream media stopped talking about? When Ukraine is destroyed or in ruins, they probably won't say much about it. But I think NATO will split rather dramatically along many, many lines. There will be a push for talks with the Russians. It will have to be from new governments in places like Germany and Berlin. Russians aren't going to pay any attention to Schultz. And they certainly aren't going to pay attention to the Biden administration as long as it's around. So it'll have to be new governments in Europe. And then I think we'll just walk away and the focus will turn entirely to China, and which is crazy because, I hear people contact me and say, well, look at what the Chinese are doing to us with fentanyl. Well, the Chinese aren't doing anything to us with fentanyl. The Chinese are supplying the ingredients for fentanyl to the so-called drug cartels in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. They are in turn weaponizing those and sending them back into the United States. Well, if you want to stop that, there's a very straightforward solution. You secure your border. You secure your ports. You control immigration. Somebody told me recently over in DHS, Doug, 20,000 Russians entered the United States last year. Okay, where are they? What are they doing? I'm sure most of them are quite happy to be in the United States, but it would seem unlikely that out of that 20,000, there weren't several agents working for Moscow.